Imagine this. You agreed on a large commission with a low budget and a short deadline, and you foolishly accepted to paint everything in non-metallic metal. Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and today I'll show you how to solve this pesky situation. And of course, the ideas you are going to see will be great also to work on your own personal warbands and armies, and in general to move your first steps in the universe of visual trickeries and intricacies that's non-metallic metal. That's why we are going to start this exploration that, if you want, can easily become a dedicated series, with 3 reasonably quick and simple examples of classic old gold, shiny fantasy silver, and a more adventurous bronze/warm deep gold with more distinct secondary reflections. Full disclaimer, I honestly think that true metallic metal is a better solution for gaming. Not because it's easier or faster, because when properly painted that's absolutely not true, but because of its dynamic, adaptive nature, able to always catch and reflect the correct real light of the environment, reliably looking great from every possible angle. But I totally get the illustrative charm of non-metallic metal, that, procedurally speaking, can be simplified in a few extremely digestible bites. Priming is a big part of my way of handling the non-metal effect, especially for gaming, where skipping a single step on 50 to 100 large and small models can save you a bunch of time and a ton of boring work. And I'm so picky about it that I'm willing to mix the specific shades I want if I don't have anything in the archive in that ballpark of value. That should be extremely dark, and tone that in fantasy and sci-fi can honestly be whatever you want. Looking at these mixes by themselves, you may miss their subtle features, and think that I'm overthinking and overdoing, but as soon as you compare the 3 applications, those subtleties become pretty obvious and not subtle at all. And since I'm here, I'm also priming and fixing a first light on the common electric blue heraldry. I'll call this meta efficiency, because it doesn't impact the single recipes, but it makes a real difference in the flow of my general work behind the camera. Still, I'm going to point it out when it happens, because maybe you like multiple different shades of metal in your forces, and you can benefit from this additional level of optimization. With the foundational blocks in place, I can start my quick 3 steps value and chromatic climb to the midtones and the lights of the first example. While painting, I envision this as a surprising gotcha moment. But you have already seen the 3 painted models, and if you have been paying attention to their shades, you know that this cold base is not the stepping stone for the silver effect, but for gold. And of course, I again use the meta efficiency magic to handle in the same way also the gold bits of the other models. Now I can suddenly steer into the warm orangey territory of the mid/local tones of the gold armor. When you hear explanations about non-metallic metal effects, usually the accent is put on the contrast between internal values and the large, sudden jump between shadows and lights. Like if everything depends on that. But I personally don't think that this is the most important aspect of the illusion. Sure, it's a big part of it, because metals truly have a higher internal contrast than a piece of dull fabric, or any other matte surface that tend to express a more gentle connection between the extremes of lights and dark areas. But this aspect becomes less and less important as soon as you move away, even a tiny bit, from pure mirror finish metal. That, if you start looking around as a metal finish, is totally not the only one possible, and probably not the most common in real life. But what is a true, ever-present constant in every metallic finish and level of polish is the super rich, chromatic nature of its reflections. Rebound light coming from every possible direction always tints even the dullest metal of a myriad of often unpredictable new tones. So I always tend to introduce strong chromatic jumps between the three blocks of shadow, mid-values and lights, to mimic that natural behavior that your brain wants to see over everything else. Then, as a secondary level of reasoning, I adjust their values based on the level of sheen I want to create. But again, the priority for me goes to the temperature and chromatic contrast. So now you can better understand the logic of my steps on the silver armor, where I move out of the warm, dark brown shadows, with a strong jump of values into the lower midtones, and a cold violet that's the perfect bridge between the warm and cold halves of the color wheel. And that I need as a base for the true mid-value and local tone of the silver armor. That has to be a fantasy, light, cold, greenish turquoise. To satisfy the need of a speedy gaming paint job, the placement of these progressive lights is very simple, and based on the idea of a general diffused zenithal light. That's always the best, less binding and problematic option for armies, that have to look good on a bunch of real-life, different environments and light situations. So, long story short, every new light simply goes in a higher spot and a smaller area. And I follow the green sensation with a proper glacial super light pyjama blue. Again, only 3 steps with a progressive but sharp increase of values, and a strong chromatic and temperature turn in the middle of the flow. For the less grounded and more artistic example of shiny bronze, I change paints just to show that the products don't matter for the success of the effect. And later I'll do the same in the brushwork stage, because I know that you always obsess too much about the specific paints. Use what you already have and like the most. As you can see, since I want to render a higher level of luster and sheen here, I move in a single, swift move from the darkest value and dullest tone of pure black to the vibrant blue of my reflections, borderline OSL. And same for the jump to the orange intrinsic local tone of the bronze, in the parts exposed to the main light source, being careful in leaving a thick black terminator between the two main effects. Again, I bridge the dark and light blocks using a light midtone that better represents the true local color of my bronze. Then I just place a single strong highlight in the middle of both these applications, using a strongly lighter tone that is simply a temperature compatible with the previous layer. So a light teal for the blue, and a warm ivory for the orange. I already have a bunch of chromatic complexity in this sketch, and for the sake of readability, it's better to keep the internal progression of the two main colors clean and simple, with no extra nuances, at least in this tiny scale. Again, I'm not focusing too much on the explanation of the actual choices of colors, because these are just potential examples, and I'm not here to sell you static recipes, but universal ideas to make you able to paint your own crazy metals. With these applications specific to every scheme in place, I can work again in assembly line mode on a couple of steps. Of course, we need a pinch of pure white to bring the value climb to its ultimate peak, and no white in the whole world sprays better than white ink. But honestly, if you're not super confident with shooting these micro dots, you can skip this step and do it with great satisfaction with the brush in the palette stage. Unlike the other applications, these points of light are so small that there's really no advantage in doing them with an airbrush, if you're not super quick and confident with it. But it's still a great exercise if you want to test your skills. Then, and this may be a shock, I seal everything under a coat of semi-gloss varnish from a spray can. You know how much I hate varnish. But similar to the work on the Grimdark Lore Vigilant, here it performs a couple of super specific functions. Oh, and I use a spray can just because in the optic of army painting, it's a way more efficient option than the airbrush. The coat of varnish is essential to make the work on the dark panel lining, of course quickly made with just black oil paint thinned down with white spirit to a heavy wash consistency. Super easy, sharp and clean. The semi-gloss satin finish has a perfect balance that lets the watery wash easily and almost automatically flow into the details. It's still coarse enough to properly grab and retain the paint, but I don't want any staining or blending contaminations between the acrylic and oil layer. So it's smooth enough to make spills and inaccurate touches, super easy to clean without affecting the thin, sharp lines, or leave stains and marks. On a more subtle level, the varnish also fuses my sprayed layers in a more solid and smooth, air quotes, single layer continuity. That usually kills the richness and depth of any other material, but that is very appropriate for the nature of metal, where you don't have layers and layers of fibers and matter, but just reflections and light effects over a single material. And like the application, the cleaning is also very deep and precise, because I want to see only clean lines and a tiny bit of shading / grime around the rivets. I spray a thin layer of matte varnish to kill the sheen and have a more functional surface for the brushwork in acrylic. But, and this is a bit more subtle and advanced, even if loose and diffused, I keep the spray more or less zenithal, because if a bit of glossiness remains in the shadows, they will look deeper, more dynamic and alive, thanks to the bit of bouncing light dancing down there. And to finish the job, I use just 2 colors per model. Okay, I admit that these shots are totally and intentionally made for shock value, and to show how much a few lighter touches on the edges can improve and seal the illusion of metal. Like it or not, when painting metal, it doesn't matter if speedy or at display level, or even if true or non-metallic. To suspend its disbelief, your brain wants to see those shiny edges, because those are another constant of real metal. You can cheat a lot in the middle, but the extremes have to stay. Good news is that with this kind of base in place, edge highlighting is an easy task, and there is still margin for a bit of cheating. Thanks to the strong, reflective nature of metal, we can effectively simplify the highlight in a single high-value pass, with no internal modulation. And the 2 colors I have on the palette are there only to let me adapt a bit the value and tone, depending on the relative position of the edge in the figure. Basically, I keep the lower edges a bit darker, and the upper edges a bit lighter, to maintain the sense of the zenithal flow. But this is kind of the next level, for when you have a bit more time. You are painting a hero or you are teaching in a YouTube video. But honestly, when painting a bunch of troopers, you can use just one high-value tone for every edge with great effect, especially when seen from the distance of the battlefield. In terms of what color to use, for the sake of simplicity here, I'm just using super light versions of my local tones, but I want at least plant the seed of the idea in your brain. Better edge highlights, especially for shinier metals than this, should be in the tone of the environmental light, that is reflected like a mirror by the polished edges. But again, for the universal needs of gaming, and the specific duller metals, this totally works. And of course, for the bitonal bronze, I need 2 sets of colors to paint the edges facing the main and the bouncing light, / OSL. And the tones I use for the blue parts are simply the ones used for the silver. If you have the time, it's also nice to add some extra information inside the extreme lights, to make them sharper, more intense and opaque, and with a bit more visual noise and character. Like for the sprayed stage, I close the work with the whitest and most brilliant white in my collection, using it for a quick application of a few very localized dots and thin lines only on the upper edges and the elements that directly look up to the main light source for a final bling effect. And here is the final result. More or less 1 hour per model, for a Nero quality level of rendering of 3 different non-metallic metal effects that share nothing but the same ideas and concepts that come directly from the observation of the real thing. And this is also the best suggestion I can ever give you on the subject. Metal is just a material, like fabric or skin, and to develop your comprehension and personal renders of any material, a conscious and inquisitive observation is absolutely everything to become able to steal all those visual tropes and secrets. And next time, the big Skaven himself, Vitzik Skauer. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials, or watch me painting live on Twitch. Check the schedule of the streams on the Twitch homepage. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!